Hello everyone and welcome to Prim Rose Light. You're here with me, Roshni, and today I'm delighted to be joined by my friend India Gill. Now, by way of brief introduction to India, India is a certified clinical trauma professional and she's got a lot of experience around attachment-based counselling. Her background stems from psychology, but she's within her career covered things like psychotherapeutic counselling, attachment-based psychotherapy, couples counselling. She's an experienced family and carers counsellor, and she's worked also supporting female prisons, which I think would be really interesting to talk about. She's also covered a lot of work around domestic abuse and exploitation as a counsellor and done some work around criminal justice. So I really was excited to bring on India to talk about some of these things. I think counselling and therapy are really big subjects. It's not often talked about as openly, and so I'm really hoping that India can demystify what is therapy, why can it be so beneficial for people, as well as also talking about some of her experiences in the criminal justice system, being a lawyer myself. So India, welcome to Prim Rose Light.
Roshni, thank you very much. What an incredibly kind introduction. Thank you.
Oh, that's very kind.
To speak to you today.
Well, likewise. So I want to get straight into it, India, and talk to you a little bit more about your journey into therapy. You know, what made you decide that this was an area that you wanted to focus on, and why did this become your vocation?
Love that question. Makes me think actually. So I came to be a psychotherapist very late in life. And what started me off on the journey was one simple question. I was coming out of quite a heavy relationship, my marriage at the time, and had one question. It's just like, why do people do what they do? You know, it had gone from this person worshipping the ground I walk on to like totally demonizing me almost. And I was like, why do people do what they do? So I went and did a psychology degree, part-time, over 6 years, whilst I was working, and actually didn't answer my question. So I thought, well, that was a waste of time. And that question then became, as I went into counselling skills courses, and then I did a diploma in psychotherapeutic counselling, the question actually became more one of, why do I do what I do? You know, what are my drivers and conditioning and all the rest of it that comes into it. So that's what actually got me into it. And I always think it's like with spirituality, you know, you either come to it through inspiration or desperation. And I think for me, it was a real curiosity and a desperation at that time, which over the course of time actually has become quite inspirational. And then literally, I think I've been studying on some sort of diploma, degree or certification for the last 10 years. And I recall a friend of mine, I had burnout last year, and he said to me, do you know, I think this is the first time since I've ever known you that you've not been studying. And I said, yeah, because I'm in hospital. And then I came out and, started another course. But I think that's just the nature of the work that we do.
I think you're forever studying yourself and others. But I like the point you make around inspiration or desperation, and I definitely want to also talk about the deeply spiritual side that you've kind of cultivated over the years. But you said something at the beginning which I want to just go back on and back to. It was the point that your former husband adored you, and then he despised you, perhaps. What do you think changed? And you know, for people that are struggling in relationships, you know, they're very hard to navigate. You know, you've got two very different people. You know, men and women already think differently, and then when you add into the mix different childhoods, maybe different cultures, different expectations, society's moved on. The role of women has changed. The role of men has changed. You know, how do two people work well together, recognizing our differences, and why do you think that people find that so difficult?
Do you know, in relationships, I think relationships are learned very early on in life from our primary caregivers, from the environments that we grow up in. And then we tend to have that blueprint and repeat patterns. For me, I was very, very non-self-aware, if that's a word. I was living very unconsciously, very conditioned. And I think in relationships with couples, it's about wanting to. It's not, if you have these two partners, it's not you and your partner against each other. It's you and your partner against whatever the issue is.
Quite.
And when I am couples counselling, one of the things that I make very, very clear is I'm not here to take sides, okay? And you are not my clients, actually. Your relationship is my client.
Yeah.
And actually, not all relationships make it. So I think people think therapy is going to fix it, but sometimes it highlights other issues, and some couples don't necessarily make it, and maybe that's the healthy route for them to go. But it's what they want. If you've got very unhealthy patterns, behaviours, communication styles, as long as you're willing to work on it, put the effort in, put the work in. Actually, that's the only part of my psychotherapeutic practice is couples counselling, where I am directive, where I do give couples homework. So yeah, it's the awareness, it's the wanting to understand each other. We can sometimes miss each other, in relationship. You come from different patterns, conditionings, all of that, history, the nature, the nurture, all of that. And then it's your love languages might be very, very different. I had a really interesting client a few weeks ago, and she was really moaning about her mother-in-law. Well, my mother-in-law is constantly, whenever I get home, there are gifts for she has bags of gifts for the children. My place is cluttered with them, and they're unnecessary. And actually, I just got home last night, and there was, it was a bag of beautiful scents. She said on my kitchen table, and she was really aggrieved by this. And I joked, and I just said to her, "Oh, yeah, what an awful mother-in-law giving you all these gifts." But the point is, when we started talking about it, her mother's love language is gifting. My client's is words of affirmation. So all she wanted was for her mother-in-law to say, "You're a good mum." Or, "Do you know what? I really appreciate this, that, and the other." So it's not that their love, the care, the relationship wasn't there. It was just that they were just missing each other.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important.
What a brilliant point. Yeah, so much. And I think, yeah, like you say, what a great point that they were, that mother-in-law very kindly was trying to show love in her way, but she just was missing the mark with with the daughter. What an interesting point. And I think so much of that is that misunderstanding, isn't it? And that ability to just say, this is what I need to feel loved and cared for. And the hope is that once you tell that to the other, that they will, either immediately or over time, deliver that for you, and vice versa.
Absolutely. It brings to mind a saying which says, "Just because I don't love you in the way that you want me to love you doesn't mean that I don't love you." But then I think we need to go further and to unpack that, get curious about that, and actually communicate. Like, how do you want me to love you? Like, what does make you feel seen, heard, understood, loved? Because in that particular example with that client, it was just like, it wasn't for a lack of love, it was just a lack of understanding. And
Totally.
maybe at a certain level, a lack of curiosity.
Yeah, that's a great point in the busyness of life. Do you have any tips then, India, for those people that are maybe less communicative or self-aware? You used the word unconscious yourself earlier. Perhaps those that don't even recognise that they just like, oh, she brought me bloody gifts and how annoying. Doesn't even realise that, she maybe needs to have a conversation, say, I really appreciate the gifts, but actually what I would really like, given the clutter, is just more affirmations. So how can we help kind of upskill, shall we say, our listeners with the tools to better communicate what they need?
Do you know, in a sentence, people aren't psychic. Tell them. Literally that. Communicate.
Yeah. How do they
Again,
communicate? What do they communicate?
sorry.
I was just saying, how do they communicate? Though, what do they communicate? Because I agree with you, people aren't psychic, but is there like language that you could give them to help?
I think we need to understand what our partner's way of communication is. It's kind of like first thing in the morning when someone's rushing to go to work is not the time to start getting into a heavy conversation. What I say to people is, don't bring up the issues that you want to address when you're already in those states of dysregulation, hyperarousal. Actually, it might be when you're out for a nice walk in nature. It might be when you're having, enjoying a nice glass of wine over dinner.
Yeah.
And then gently bring them up, because you're both going to be more receptive to talking about it. So I think environment is really, really important. Not just, where you are, but the environment of like how you're feeling, how your partner's feeling. Then it's going to be more conducive to healthy communication, to them actually hearing you. Because a lot of time in couples it'll be like, well, I've said this forever and you just don't listen. And okay, let's try saying it in another way. It's like a client complaining, oh, he never brings me a cup of tea. That's all I want. That's all I ask is like, if he could bring me a cup of tea in the morning. So I said, you know what? Why don't you try modelling that behaviour for him? Why don't you take him a cup of tea and let's just see how over time that impacts you. And invariably it will impact your partner. And because we model behaviour for our children, children will listen more, and people actually will listen more, not to what you tell them, but in how you present yourself, in the things that you do. I can sit here telling my children, oh, you've got to eat your greens, etc. And then I'm not eating my greens and tucking into some very unhealthy, whatever. So I think it's in the way that we present, in the way that we actually live, that can... this brings to mind a girlfriend of mine years ago, and someone had sent her a not great photo of a male friend of ours, and I just said to her, why do you think he felt that he could send that to you? Because I can guarantee you that he wouldn't send that to me. So do you see, it's like how we are, how we present in life actually shows people how to communicate with us, what our boundaries are. And I think that's really important in our intimate relationships. Boundaries are not to keep people out. Boundaries are an act of love.
For ourselves. Yeah. What a super point, India. Thank you for sharing that. And actually just taking that a bit further. So what is it that, because I think a lot of us are quite unconscious to how we might present externally. We have this facade that we, have our public, face, but we're obviously not always going to know how we appear to others, who have their own biases, etc. Do you have any thoughts as to how we can become more self-aware of how we present and therefore what we're willing to accept and not accept? That photo being a really interesting one.
Yeah, as in how we present, just be you, be authentically you. And that's another thing where people say, oh, India, you're always saying on your social media, your vibe attracts your tribe. What does that mean? That kind of means like when you don't have these masks on, when we don't present in a way that, we think that we're acceptable to others, that's when our authentic self, with all of our quirks and imperfections, that's when we're going to really attract our tribe, the people who actually see us, because we allow them to see us, right, for who we authentically are. That's your people. Can you just rewind on the question that you originally asked? So
I just was really picking up on that point you made around the picture that your friend received that was a little uncomplimentary, whereas he wouldn't have sent that to you. And I was just curious that what is it that maybe gave that impression to him that he could send that to her and not to you? Like what? Because we have to be self-aware of how we're coming across. What are we willing to accept, such that boundary it's either respected or it isn't. So I was just curious, how can we ensure that, where possible, our boundaries are respected, and actually people are kind towards us, because you have to be aware for that, and you need to know actually there'll be a consequence. India will reprimand me. She will say, hey, what are you doing? Whereas maybe the friend wouldn't, and therefore you can get away with it, if you see what I mean.
So I'll use that example again. Okay, so if somebody sends you risque jokes which you don't really appreciate, and you respond as you feel that you should respond to them, like, oh, that's so funny, etc. I wouldn't do that. I'd be like, can you please not send me this kind of thing again? I am maybe a little bit too boundaries at times, and I have done that in the past. I'd be like, yeah, I don't like this kind of humour. Can you not send this to me again? And invariably they won't. So it's what we allow. It's, again, going back to being authentic. When my friend may have, and I'm not saying she did this, may have actually given that person some sort of permission in the way that she has responded in the past. Right? And I think I just do that naturally. But if you don't like something, and because I'm always on this journey of growth, way before I came into this industry, is just ask for feedback from your friends about, okay, I'll give you another example of me. When I asked for feedback, it was just like, I'd be invited to any and every party or anything going wherever I was, and I said to my friend, oh my god, like, why is it? And I just don't feel that I'm taken seriously, etc. And he said to me, this being really, really vulnerable and transparent, he was like, oh, look at the way that you dress. And I was just like, very tight clothes and crop tops and all of this. And he was just like, because it's like your entertainment. And that really spoke to me. And he was really candid with me. And it was a rude wake-up call. But, and I was overseas at the time. So when I came back here I lived in London. And when I came back here, I promise you, Roshni, for a year, I went to the other extreme. I was wearing nothing but saris. Would go to Cipriani's, would go to the Collection, a bar that we used to hang at, and I'd rock up in my sari. And my friends didn't like it. But I was consciously trying to change the way that I was perceived. And maybe not you don't have to go to those extremes. But that's in my unconscious way again, where I was just kind of like, oh, I don't want to be perceived like this, and let me dress like this. And that's not who I was internally. I was just like, this happy-go-lucky, very unaware chick.
And so that's very interesting. You kind of went from one extreme to the other, but you obviously cared. This friend left a bit of an indelible mark on you. Why did you care what people think, being that happy-go-lucky?
I think I've always cared, but unknowingly, it's the conditions of worth that we have from when we're, how we're raised. I'll give you another. So a lot of my work is anecdotal. And it's when I got divorced. Well, when I first left my husband, the first ever time. This was just a few months after being married. And this is the conditions of worth which I didn't know were upon me. So, it's like, your parents love you, they do everything for you. And then I left, and my dad was fuming, like literally fuming. And to cut a long story short, they made me go back. And that's when I realised the conditions of worth that were at play. I thought, wow, you know what, you love me, accept me, celebrate me, as long as I'm towing the line, as long as I'm, doing what you want me to do. But as soon as I want something different, and the conditions of worth, like, I will love you,
Conditionally on you doing what
I will love you if, it's like with children, parents give them this underlying impression that I will love you if you get these grades, if you achieve this. So I think conditions of worth were huge on me, and it was the disease to please.
Well, thank you for sharing that vulnerably, India, because you certainly won't be alone in that. I think all parents are well intentioned and, want their children in that example to, get good grades, to, work at their marriage, all very, fair, sensible requests. But it's just that it's a request. You need to do this, so I feel better. So society doesn't shame me in some way. So is it almost kind of them not wanting to kind of sit in their own pain, and so therefore they're happy for sort of the facade to continue? So I guess what I'm wondering is, how do people set themselves free, wanting to still be maybe good to children, get good grades? I think that's very important. Work at your marriage, again, there's something around perseverance, but not when you're unhappy. So how can do you have any thoughts, having gone through that, as to what the right line is? Because my feeling, not being married or having children as yet, is that we're the gatekeepers for our children's dreams and aspirations, and we should kind of nurture and cultivate confidence and ensure that they have the skills such that they can go out and fly with or without us, but that we should not indoctrinate them and condition them to be little mini-me's. And of course, we will inevitably disappoint them, but if they know that it's not done with that spirit, they can kind of look back and be like, this is just part of this soul's journey.
I don't think parents do it consciously. I don't think,
Oh
we
no,
go
totally.
out to do this. But we're running our own patterns as parents. I can look back now as a 60-year-old woman and think, and I've actually said this to my son, I'm like, wow, I was such a bad mother. I was such an unconscious mother. I literally just did what I was told to do, and that's how I raised my children. Now I would do it so differently. I see how my son and daughter-in-law raise their children, and they won't even argue in front of them. And they're just like so much more interactive. I think I come from a time when children were not really considered that much. It's like they were not to be seen and just to keep quiet and not
Yes, to be seen and not heard. Yes,
that's
yes.
it, to be seen and not heard. It's a very, very, very different time now. Going back to, nobody, I don't think, most parents do this with any malintent. We want the best for our children. But let's learn to listen. And see, being a South Asian and concentrating maybe on this community, a lot of our parents had their conditioning and come from, other countries, and we were immigrants here. And then we continue with that, all of those values, etc. And a lot of our values are amazing, but we've got to fit into the environment where we are. So your child's going to have different influences at school with their peers. And then when they come home, they're almost living a different life, according to your condition. So I think it's actually to ourselves become a little bit more aware. All roads lead to awareness, I think, in what I'm saying. When I'm reflecting on what I'm saying. So, yeah. Does that kind of answer your question, or is that not quite what you were asking?
It does. I mean, I think you're right. I genuinely don't think parents intend any of this with malice. I just wonder that they are almost a victim for their own kind of hopeful success. They kind of want you to have the happy marriage so that they can be like, or even if you're not happy, that at least they are like, oh, my daughter's gotten married, or oh yes, look, she got 12 A stars, isn't she? She's going to be a doctor or a lawyer. That is the South
And
Asian
she's
dream.
miserable, but it's okay that she's
And she's
miserable.
miserable, but visually it all looks wonderful, and I just
Yeah.
wonder, is there are we tricking our youngsters a little bit? And look, you're a mum, you've been, you've had children, you now see your grandchildren, you've had 60 years of life. What is your honest thing? Do we kind of like to look like these graceful swans a little bit, to the detriment of being real and authentic, which was sort of your previous point?
None of it, we're all just kind of muddling through, aren't we? And change is hard. So for us to even want to change is amazing. What does Robin Sharma says? He says something along the lines of, change is really hard in the beginning, messy in the middle, but gorgeous at the end.
Great, great.
So another example I'll give you. So, I set up a counselling provision across a trust of schools. Now, in that school, a lot of the older teenagers, 17, 18, they could not wait to leave home. And with a view to not ever coming back, because there were such restraints on them, such, again, whatever conditions on them at home.
Yeah.
Which are in keeping culturally with a different age, actually, I would say, not even a different environment, but a different age. It's like 18-year-olds or 17-year-olds not being allowed to have their phones, not being listened to. It's my way or the highway kind of thinking.
Yes.
And so these children want to escape that environment. So then they go off to university, and a few of my sixth formers will still give me updates, etc., on, their journeys now that they are at uni, and they don't want to go home, and there's that rupture. So I just think we need to not be as stringent. We need to trust our children a little bit more. We need to allow them to be expressive instead of shutting them down, because whatever their views are don't necessarily align with our own. And it's not just about us changing, because I think a lot of the values and principles that we're guiding our children, the intention of all of those is really good. It's admirable. It's very elevated, but it's the way in which we do it. It's the lack of understanding that actually these children are kind of struggling between two cultures, whether they're conscious of it or not. Because I always said, oh no, I never struggled with that. But now on reflection, I think, wow, actually, yeah, maybe I did, without realising it.
Interesting. I mean, I'm not sure I agree about parents being elevated, actually. So a slight challenge on that. I think some are. I think parents try. I undoubtedly say that. But I think that curiosity is sometimes lacking. So I agree with you. And I think you make a good point around kind of culturally, societally, things have moved on considerably in the last maybe 20, 30 years in particular. I think more and more women now are in the workforce, whereas perhaps before maybe you would have your mum at home for longer periods of time. That had an impact on your attachment style. And the way you were kind of interacting with the world. I think obviously social media has done a huge number on us all, and I think we're a lot more, our attention spans are much shorter. We're just looking for that visual fix, that kind of stimulus fix, and I think it's really hard for youngsters. I think it's a horrible time to be a youngster in that sense, because there's a lot of pressure, I think, for youngsters. I think there's gender questions and who am I, identity crises. So I think there's a lot there, and I think it's probably very bewildering for the parents. But I don't necessarily think that. I think that their way is always the right way. I think that they haven't fully understood the world has changed as dramatically, but you need to kind of provide a bit of stability, I think, for the children as well. But then you have to be curious to learn about their inner world to then provide that stability based on what they need, rather than kind of, I think, imprinting 20, 30, 40, 50-year-old knowledge, which was probably relevant then, but like you say, with that cultural change, with maybe that immigrant background, that's changed. If your children are born here, they are going to be more westernized, and they'll get their dose of culture through you as parents or the school. So I think it's a very complicated,
No,
very
I completely
nuanced.
agree with you, Roshni. I think we're saying the same thing. So when I say parents, they have these elevated, and I admire that, it's the aspirations that we have for our children, not
Yes,
that they're
yes.
elevated in their thinking necessarily.
Yeah,
But it's
yeah,
like,
totally agree with that. Yeah.
yeah. So I think
Yeah,
we're on the
no,
same
thank you
page.
for clarifying. Elevated more in in what they hope, and like I said, that's very, very admirable. I think it's very difficult, and I wanted to ask you more about that, because obviously you've worked with domestic violence survivors, you've worked with children. You do a lot of therapy. What are the core issues that you see? Are there themes within the various? You've worked in female prisons. Are there themes that you see? Societal themes, attachment themes. What is it that you see in your therapy that you could talk to?
Do you know early environment, the whole nature and nurture thing? I think nurture has a lot to do with it. I think it's unmet needs, a lot of it. Like basic needs, like to be seen, to be heard, to be known, to be understood, to be loved. And I think a lot of how we operate today, our adult wounds, so to speak, come from unmet childhood needs. And I'm not talking about like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, because the basics usually, I'm assuming, are met. In a lot of cases, my work in prisons, a lot of those basic needs actually weren't met. And I think what I find in my work is that environmental factors, whether it's the environment of the family, like wherever you have been raised, has a huge, huge impact on how you go forward in life and how you go and present in life. When I work with trauma, we use ACEs, an ACEs questionnaire, which is Adverse Childhood Experiences. And when you look at that, the higher people score, it's a set of 10 questions, and the higher they score on that, the more they're predisposed to certain health presentations, mental health presentations. They're predicators for how they're actually probably going to perform in life to a large degree. There used to be, when I was growing up, there was a series on TV. It was like, show me the child at 7 and I'll show you the man. And
Mm.
it was a longitudinal study, documentary, and they took these children at 7, and then every 7 years they would go back to these same children and look at where they were educationally, and then their formative years, formative environments, almost held them hostage for where
Mm.
they were going to be in later life.
Yeah, that's a brilliant point. I want to ask you more about nature and nurture, India, and what that practically means to you. Like, what's the nature argument of what you're saying, and what do you mean by nurture? And then I have another question, but I'll stagger
Incredible
them for you.
question. No, I love that question. So nature kind of loads the gun, right? And nature loads the gun, and then nurture pulls the trigger.
Yeah.
So this is, when I say load the gun, that's what we're born with, and that can even be go as far. It's not just eye color, height, etc. It can be our temperaments. So, and nurture. I've got this a beautiful story which I heard years ago, and I'll share that with you, about how nurture is so much more important sometimes than nature. And it's like fleas. So fleas, have you heard this? So
No?
fleas naturally can jump at least 10 times their height.
Hmm.
So what this study did is they got this bunch of fleas and they put them in jam jars. And that's how they were raised, in jam jars, these fleas. So, they try to jump higher because that's their genetic predisposition. But once they hit the jar lid, that's it. So over time, this kept going on. Then they let these fleas out of the jam jar. And you know what's going to happen, right? They could only jump to the height
Mm.
of where the lid had been. And that's the power of nurture. And not only that, but it went further to say that the offspring of these fleas who were born in that environment, guess what? They were
That's
just only able. Isn't that amazing? So
that's very
I
interesting.
don't think that nature is necessarily, it's not solid, you know. There's a physicist whose work I love, Dr. Joe Dispenza. He does a lot of work on neuroplasticity, and I love his work because he ties, like manifestation and spirituality. So a lot of people disregard it because, oh, that's woo-woo nonsense. So what he
Mm.
does as a scientist, as a physicist, and because we have the means now with technology, equipment, etc., is provide the evidence-based research to show how this works. So, but just to rewind back to our original point, yeah, that's how I think it
That's a
works.
really
And
interesting analogy.
isn't it
No, thank
amazing?
you, India.
There's
That
so
is
many
very,
beautiful
very interesting.
anecdotes like that, and I think these are beautiful ways of explaining it to children. There's another one about the baby elephant in a circus. Hate circuses, but a baby elephant in a circus, and it's tied to this stump, which is about, I don't know, that high. Um,
Mm.
Now it comes to this circus when it's a baby, and then it grows, and then it's like this, 1 ton, 2 ton, 3 ton, whatever elephants weigh, massive, great beast of a creature, and it's still only tied to that little stump. It doesn't know that it could wreak havoc. It could probably destroy, all of this environment that it's in, that people trample over them, kill them.
Mm.
It doesn't have that, and it could just pull this little stump, poof, out that, like that with its trunk. But no, it still circles around, and that, Roshni, is the power of our conditioning.
Mm.
So when I
So
talk
true.
on awareness, it's kind of like, it's a very easy thing to say, but it initially, to get that awareness is really, really hard because we're living in that environment. How do we see anything different? Now, we're really lucky now,
Mm.
in many ways lucky and in many not. It's a double-edged sword, is with social media, because actually ignorance is a choice.
Very true. I think though it requires knowledge that you are probably being ignorant or some sense of it to even
Well, that there
have
is
the
difference.
chance.
There are people like me, and they're doing differently. You know, that flea's jumping higher, or just to say, or oh my gosh, that elephant is like a powerhouse, and that's just like us in thinking, in capping our potential because of the environments that we're in. But we have such exposure through the internet.
Yeah,
Different
such a great point.
environments and ways of being. And if someone else can do it, why can't you?
Totally. No, I love that. And there's a lot of power, I think, in what you've said there. One of the things that I was keen to ask you, though, is, like you're saying about nurture. And if you're blessed to have parents that have, high aspirations, they're quite liberal and they see the world in a big way and, go fetch, the sky's the limit sort of thing. That's wonderful. But if your parents aren't, maybe they kind of think you need to operate within a box, that would be really difficult for people that maybe their own soul might be really big and expansive, but their conditioning restrains them. Have you got any thoughts on that? How do you get free if you're like a butterfly and you've got these big expansive visions, but you're a bit stuck, whether it's a marriage, whether it's you're young and you're at home, whatever it might be, you're in a job that doesn't really see your potential. It could be any number of things, right? This happens in our day-to-day lives.
I think a lot of it is to have your boundaries in place, because we love so much, because we have these extended families and communities with our South Asians and the way that we're raised. It's almost like duty comes first, we come second, and we have this tendency to always put ourselves second, especially as females. And that's not necessarily an act of love. We're all here to fulfill our own potential. Again, going back to my own example, because I feel like, real life stories are a really powerful way of learning, is as much as my family didn't like the fact that I had chosen a divorce, and they haven't approved of a lot of my life choices. Actually now, and this is extended family, will say, oh, how did you manage to negotiate and navigate that? Because this person didn't, and it's because I had that exposure, because I guess adversity led me to it. And it was the being on my own, and I think a lot of the struggles that I went through taught me different things. So, and how else would we navigate it? Yeah, it's really hard. It's really hard in that environment, and I'm really not downplaying that, but it's just to have a sense of what you want to do, to have a sense of self. Yeah.
It's a double whammy, isn't it? I mean, what you've said is really inspirational because you were going through difficult things, and then, if you didn't have the family support, you were also battling that as well to sort of be like, no, I think I'm going to push through. So that takes more energy from perhaps the aim and the sort of road you wanted to lead. That's quite exhausting in a way that I think you're right. Certainly, say South Asian cultures have that. I'm sure many other cultures do, but some cultures don't. It's quite single-minded. You're 18, you're cut loose, you get on with your life, and your decisions are yours. You lie in the bed you made, sort of thing. That's certainly not the case in South Indian culture, which is very like, oh, why are you doing this and why are you doing that and who are you seeing and blah, blah, blah. And it's kind of endless questions, all well intentioned. It's just it can be quite sabotaging and tiring and suffocating if not appropriately managed and the right boundaries aren't in place. So I just wondered, how did you kind of keep your energy at probably what is quite a lonely time, because you haven't got the family support that you perhaps want at these lonely times?
I think I was very lucky, because as much as there was my mum and my brothers, as much as my mum didn't agree with what I was necessarily doing, she did support me. Because I don't agree with your decision, but I support the fact that, this is what you're doing. And so that was really helpful. And one of my brothers, my younger brother, was just like, well, she's done things your way, so now let her do things her way. So that was really, really helpful. So I think I had that supportive environment. However, yeah, it was really hard, because I did withdraw from the community quite a lot because of judgment because of, like, always having to explain your story, which I didn't. I'm an avoidant. I don't speak to people about my story. So this is actually a real first for me. And I have become like this, over the last decade. But I was a closed book. So yeah, it is really hard. But you have to trust that the people who love you will want the best for you. And I agree with you. It's a real struggle, and I see that struggle with other people. And we all navigate it in our own different ways. But yeah, it's love, it's communication, and it's actually, I went ahead and did what I did, and now my entire family is very, very proud of me. And it's like now I'm seen as the strong, the resilient one. And
Well, that's what I wonder, isn't it? You were perhaps not the black sheep, but you were a bit misunderstood. Why is she doing this? You're acting out of line. But with time, actually, now you're this resilient, strong, we really admire. But there was obviously some change in that thinking. Maybe it's just not giving a two hoots and just doing what you want, and actually people fall into line.
I
And if they
know, I do,
do,
yeah. That I really love Dick Schwartz's parts theory because it denotes that we have these different parts. So there was a part of me, on reflection, which did care, which loved my family, which still wanted to adhere, and fit in and make them proud. And then there was this other part of me, this something that I couldn't even fight, which was just leading me to all of these different places and environments and learnings. And whether they were positive or negative, they were all in their way conducive to my growth. So I think you have to trust what Carl Rogers calls the actualizing process. That he makes this analogy of a potato, just forgotten underneath the sink, and there's a little drip from the pipe nurturing this potato. And it's basically saying that we as human beings have this innate capacity to actualize despite the conditions that we are in. And when I think of that, so I go off on a tangent sometimes, so wind me back in, but it takes me back to a lot of the Holocaust survivors who would be in their 90s or what have you now. There's one called Edith Eger who I follow on social media. But overall, when you listen to these people speak and ask them about their environment, the environment of the concentration camps, or you saw your, loved ones, brothers, sisters, parents, children, malnutritioned, badly treated, and then going to these gas chambers knowing that they're never going to return. How did you, live with that? How did you manage that, cope with that? And you know what they say is, I didn't let them in here.
Mm.
And I believe that life starts and ends up here. It's like, was it Henry Ford who said, if you think you can or if you think you can't, you're right.
yes.
So it's kind of like one believing in that innate actualizing tendency that you will get to where you want to get to, but you have to have a plan, and it's not about rallying against our caregivers. They essentially want the best for us most of the time, and it's knowing that, but also knowing what you want. And again, it comes down to communication, but we're not always heard in these environments, A lot of the time you're shut down. Sometimes we have to remove ourselves from those environments, which again, I know is particularly hard and comes with its own, challenges. But it's just stay on your own journey, whether it's in that environment, like, the Holocaust survivors, they were in that environment, they couldn't escape it. And I'm not
Really interesting.
I'm not kind of correlating that with our Asian family environments, but they survived it, and actually they went on to thrive and teach other people how they
Totally.
manage, etc. There's
I think that's a good example.
someone really recently, I forget her name now. She's a Harvard professor, Ellen. I want to say Ellen Langer. And this ties in with the forgiveness part of, the Holocaust survivors, etc. And she said, I don't want anyone to ever forgive me. And I was like, oh wow, because a lot of spirituality and everything is based on forgiveness, forgive others and you set yourself free and all of this. And I've always gone along with that. And then I heard this woman saying, and I was thinking, oh, and she said, I don't want anyone to ever forgive me, because actually inherent in forgiveness is an element of blame. So there's got to be an element of blame in order for someone to forgive you. So she said, I don't want anyone to ever forgive me. I want them to understand me. And I think going back to these, family environments is, if you're not getting your needs met, it's one to try and communicate them at least, okay, have the awareness to do that. But it's like in the understanding of the other's frame of reference, which again is a huge part of my work, is people say, how can you work with paedophiles and murderers, etc., in prisons and all of this? Because I'm not there to judge them. So person-centered training is at the core of my practice. And that's Carl Rogers. And it's kind of like you enter everything with empathy, unconditional positive regard, and congruence. So I am going to gently, if you say something which deeply saddens me and you're sat there smiling, I'll be like, oh, you know what, that really hit me and that makes me really sad. Actually, that really upsets me. So just to be congruent with that. And it doesn't matter. Yeah, I have worked with, I work with perpetrators. And it's understanding their frame of reference. No, and I remember when I used to go into prisons and, to have the initial assessment one-to-one, there was this massive, great, I don't know if you remember Giant Haystacks, that's my generation probably, it's a massive great wrestler, anyway, this chap was like 6'5" and almost just as broad, and we're in this tiny little room where I had to do my initial assessment with him. So the guard led me there, as usual, and because this chap was particularly big, so there's just like, a little table between us either side, and this real, very, very small room, and the guard came back in, and it was almost, I think it was more as a warning to my client and a reminder to me, maybe, because I know this. And he said, oh, just to make you aware that there's a panic button here. Please don't press it, because if you do, all the guards in the vicinity will come running. And I looked at him and I just thought, well, yeah, you know that I know that. And I think he was, clarifying it to my client, because he was, so I don't know what their interactions with him were. But he was a drug dealer and did the assessment. And I just said to him, I just put the assessment literally aside, and I just had to lean forward and I said, do you know, when you were a child, you don't think, I'm going to hurt people, I'm going to be a drug dealer, I'm going to be living in a... Like, what happened? How are you here? And all of a sudden, and I was, he had a very scary sort of demeanour, very po-faced and aggressive looking. Suddenly his entire body relaxed, and he literally leaned forward on his arm and just stayed there. So I held the silence, just held space for him. And then he says, no one's ever asked me that before. I think that was, and it upsets me thinking back to him, I think that was the first time I ever cried in clinical supervision, because it's such a broken system here. Yeah. So it's kind of like stepping into the other person's frame of reference, because, when you're a child, you don't think, oh, I'm going to be a murderer, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. Have understanding. I've suddenly started to have this new signature the last year, and it's like lead with love and approach with curiosity with a view to understanding, because we're all just muddling through, right?
Beautiful, India. I mean, that's such a... No, I mean, it's a beautiful way. It's both spiritual, it's the kind and right thing to do, but it's also hopefully giving people some hope, that are in these situations. I mean, you said so much there, but I kind of was curious to ask you what got you into the work with prison, people who've... Because,
purely by chance, Roshni, purely by chance. I used to be a Samaritan, and I loved it. I think I got as much from it as I, gave. And then I got selected to be in the core team. There were about, I think, how many of us were? This was many, many years ago, decades ago now. I think there were about 4 of us in the core team. So we'd go into a Class A female prison, Bronzefield in Ashford. And that's what got me into prison work. And oof. So, as a Samaritan, they never have to tell you their story. And you make that clear to them. But they want to.
Yeah.
When they get that safe environment where they are accepted with unconditional
Totally.
positive regard, we're not there to judge them. They will open up and give you their stories, and it was an absolute privilege and honour to be in that space and to be privy to that. And it's not been, much of my life has been quite, it's just happened. It's just happened to me. So you spoke about, I started my life with that question in this industry about why do people do what they do. Then that morphed into why do I do what I do. So, which was beautiful because the work was hard, but I began to really love it because it's really fruitful as well. So I started with that, and then serendipitously, I was looking for a placement all those years ago, and my then tutor said, "Oh, I do some supervision work for rape crisis. Why don't you apply to them?" So I did, and I got it. Then I ended up working for them with a lot of their complex clients. So I didn't choose to work for rape crisis; it's just something that happened. And even domestic abuse, it was just. And now I kind of like just got email a few weeks ago. I think my life has just happened, and it's almost like God's plan. And maybe me being unconscious all those years, and just like if I had been as conscious as I am now, I wouldn't have had the experiences that I have had. And I wouldn't have had the relationships that I have had, which have been amazing in, as much as they haven't lasted, they have been absolutely amazing. So I think when you kind of like are just at ease with yourself, which is what I am now, and I'm not looking to, I want to work in this industry or that industry, but I do work in the music industry with some clients. And I think it's just when you're diligently doing the work that you do and you're really passionate about it and you're not looking for anything, this is just my work, it's my bread and butter, and I want to do it to the best of my ability. And then just through the music industry, I just got an email the other week saying, "Oh, so and so recommended you, and we wonder if we're doing this new trial at the major festivals around the country, and we're looking for a psychotherapist, and we wonder if you would be interested in being that psychotherapist. You'd have a support team
Fantastic.
around you." Yeah. And I just thought, I've never looked for this, it's just happened.
Yeah,
Uh,
fantastic.
yeah, it's just amazing. So I think if you diligently just carry on, and I'm passionate about what I do. My friends hate it because they'll be like, "You're always reading, etc., and you're always doing this, you're always working." And I'm like, "But this isn't work to me. I could be on a beach and I could be reading about trauma, but that's what I love. And
Yeah.
I'll wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning because I'll be like, oh, you know what, this is how I need to work with this client. That would be really helpful." So I think and it doesn't matter what you do, it doesn't matter if you're a neuroscientist, if you're a cleaner, if you're whatever you do in life, do it to the best of your ability, and the universe will conspire to help you.
Beautiful. I think that's lovely, India, and I agree. I mean, words of comfort, skillfully administered, are the oldest therapy known to man. That's a nice quote by
Love that.
Louis Nizer. And it's sort of what you're saying, really, isn't it? That ability to just listen, hold space, to not judge. And all sorts of opportunities have come your way from, music industry, to music festivals, to therapy. I am curious. You said something earlier which I thought was really profound, which was you were very unconscious and now you're a lot more conscious. Talk to us about that journey. What did unconscious mean to you, and
Oh
what does
Lord.
conscious mean to you now?
I know my patterns now. I know why I do what I do most of the time. And it's a journey, and I think we're on this journey until we're in the grave. Um, it's the relationships that I got into. For the first time in my life, I've been single for the last 10 years. I've never been single. I've just gone from one relationship to another. I've never chosen them. It's kind of like, these hunter-gatherer types have just pursued me, I've given in, and we've got into a relationship. So that was unconscious. That was just living unconsciously, right? Now that I'm conscious, and actually it's harder actually in this respect to be conscious. I remember going on a date a few years back. Amazing, amazing, amazing man. And we had like the best first date. And at the end of it, he said to me, "Oh, so we can do this, or this the next time that we see each other. And it was such an amazing day. I was on the floor laughing, like virtually, all of the time. And then I just said to him at the end of the night, "Oh, do you know what? No, I don't think I could get into a relationship with you." And he was just like, "Why?" And I just said, "Because you feel too much like home. You're my pattern." And he's the kind of guy that I've always gone for. And we stayed in touch, and we're like friends. He's actually probably going to be on this podcast that I'm going to start in a couple of weeks. And he was so much my pattern, and I can now recognise that I remember in my last relationship, the realisation came to me, and again, an amazing relationship. And one day I just looked at him, and it was just looking at his hands. And funny how that's all it took, and I said to him, "Do you know what? I've been dating my father." And I looked back at all of my relationships, and I thought, my God, I've been dating my dad. And as amazing as my dad was, like, you know, he was like gorgeous, he was generous, he was this alpha male, but he had this real controlling side to him as well. And he had, he had this real dysfunction to him as well. And I look back and reflecting on all my relationships, and I think, wow, I just dated my father. And so now I'm determined not to do that. And I think the most growth that I've had, personally, professionally, I mean, I've got into business, I've got into property now, but it's all happened within the last decade of me being alone, of me just concentrating on me putting me first. And I don't think it's selfish to put yourself first. You know, I think in our cultures, we're taught to put ourselves second and to put the family, and there's nothing wrong with that, but no, without us, actually nothing happens. We can't pour from an empty cup.
Totally. Well, I know you've done work with Virgin, the flight company, and obviously you have to put your own mask first before you can help someone else. So it's exactly that same analogy.
And
I was
really,
No, go on.
no, really, I really truly believe in that. And I think we've spoken about this, that I had burnout last year.
Yes.
Because I was just working. And actually, some of the work is not work that was serving me necessarily. It was a labour of love. I loved it, but it wasn't compensating me as my private practice was. And it was a very, very, very long distance to travel. But it was a labour of love. But I was giving and putting myself again second. And my body shut down on a couple of occasions. But, you know, I rested, being the resilient woman that I am, and then I would carry on again. And I remember a therapist friend of mine saying to me, "Do you know what, India, you don't seem to be able to give yourself permission not to show up, to stop." So, and Belinda, thank you. And she said, "I'm giving you permission not to show up." And that really stayed with me. But I carried on. And then my body sent me a huge message where it just shut down. I collapsed and ended up in hospital with burnout. I was on morphine and drips and all sorts for a week. Contracted ocular shingles, which I'm still suffering with today. So I think there's a high price to pay when we don't put ourselves first.
And thank you for sharing that, India, because we don't talk enough about. I think burnout, mental health, is often used, but we don't talk that much about burnout, particularly I think South Asian culture. Again, and I don't mean to make it cultural, because actually it clearly pervades. It's a human experience if we're not careful. But I'm grateful to you for bringing it up as a South Asian woman. I mean, what do you think got you there, and how did you? It sounds like you were quite unconscious to the fact that you needed to just step back, but you're a doer, so maybe that pattern of wanting to feel valuable, helpful, push through, I'm strong, resilient, 60 years of this, I can do more, but your body gave up. How can we better listen, I guess, to the signs of our body and our minds, because there has to be a kind of a communication between the two?
Well, it was a number of factors coming together. It was the children I was working with. I was like very, very invested with them. It was self-neglect. Sometimes, and it comes back to that word unconscious, and then on this side, self-awareness. So I knew that I was struggling. My body was telling me that I was tired, I wasn't partaking of, like, the things that I love, I wasn't socializing, it was just work, 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 work. And I am a very resilient woman, that's just the way I am, and I've been raised and generationally, and the whole avoidant attachment style still at the core comes into it, even though I have a secure attachment now. So I was just running. And I think it was kind of like, my son said this to me. He's like, "Why are you running so hard?" He's like, "Because we're all financially secure. Why are you working so hard?" And it goes back to my beliefs about me, I guess, at the core, that I have to kind of prove myself. I love what I do, so there was that element of it. Then there was like, oh, my brothers are huge in property, etc., and I'm not. So I only just got into that in the last few years, and that was because of the virtue of working so hard. I've been raised that my success, my finance, my everything is going to be may come from male connection, from my husband. It came from my father, it came from my husband. And then because that was my conditioning, then automatically I just attracted these, alpha males who took care of me. I don't think I've ever taken care of myself until the last 10 years in lots of different ways. So now, yeah, it is about me. And how did I get to that point? I was giving too much of myself. Unconscious. We can recognize this in others, but not in ourselves sometimes. So I had a client at the time, older teenager, 17, 18, had a lot of trauma in her life, like a lot of trauma. And she scored very high on the ACEs on the ACEs questionnaire. And she said to me, "Do you know, some days I just can't come into school, I just can't get out of bed." And she had a not great attendance record. So I said to her, "Why is that? Like, what do you do?" She said, "Well, I just stay in bed." And I said, "But what do you do in bed? Are you scrolling? What are you doing?" And she said, "No, I can't. I just can't move. I just lie there." So as she explained this to me, I just thought, she was a very closed off girl, so it was an honour that she was actually even feeling safe enough to open up to me. And I said, that's a trauma response, because I knew her life, and her body was just shutting down, and she just physically could not move. Now, I went on to experience this because I have a lot of vicarious trauma, but I didn't acknowledge it. So my body would literally shut down like that, and I'd give it rest for 24 hours, and then I'd get back to it. So I think that's what it was, and that's what led to the burnout. And I remember saying to my daughter-in-law, "Do you know what, I'm actually really grateful that this has happened." And she was like, "Not even you can see a silver lining in this." And I said, "Well, yeah, because I could have actually lost my sight through the ocular shingles. And actually, if I didn't stop now, it could be a lot worse." So I did. I went back and handed in my notice at the school. And I literally stopped working mornings, and I just sat down and wrote out, okay, what do I need to do, and what am I doing that's unnecessary? So I literally work 3 days a week. I don't work mornings. I start my work in the afternoon. I've put my self-care protocol in place in the mornings. I'll have my hour of power. I'll go for yoga or go for a walk with a friend or neighbour. So it's like all of that self-care stuff has come back in. A lot of trauma, I think, I carry a lot of vicarious trauma, and that needs to be released. So I have a protocol of a monthly massage now. I will go for sound baths because that releases, and relaxes your cells. So self-care is, back to what it used to be prior to me getting into this industry. And
Brilliant. No, thank you for sharing very vulnerably. I mean, there's a beautiful quote from Michelle Obama where she says, "Sadly, too often the stigma around mental health prevents people from who need help seeking it." But that simply doesn't make any sense, because when we have an illness, say, which affects your heart or your arm or your brain, it's an illness and there shouldn't be any distinction. So we've got to make it clear that getting help isn't a sign of weakness. Yeah, it's
so
very
not.
powerful. We kind of, I think, disconnect when there's something mentally I think that, and that can be very paralyzing, because like you say, with you being able to your body crashing, or that youngster, clearly have got so much life in you both, but what is it? It's a bit of a trauma response. Our body and our minds aren't connected because we are, just maybe living unauthentically, or we've got criticism and judgment and all sorts happening. So it's a really sad place to be. Do you have any tips for perhaps youngsters, or people of all ages that might be feeling that their body just shuts down on them? What can they do? Having you've experienced it, what can they do? How can they get help?
First, speak to someone about it. Don't try and do it alone. Okay. You don't get any brownie points for doing it alone, and which I try to do, because my storied self was like, yeah, I'm going to do this on my own. I don't need any help. Ask for help. And I think not just with children, but with most of us, there's like something it's just something I've invented myself. It's like the table of life. So let's just say my little man here is a table, and your table has 4 legs. So this comes from 2 different studies which I've married together. Do you know when you go to your doctor will say, oh, what's your sleep like? What's your diet like? What's your exercise like? 3. So this comes from evidence-based research. Our doctors never explain to us why they're asking us. They'll just ask us and then they move on, or maybe prescribe or whatever. So sleep is imperative for well-being. That's one of the legs of this table. Okay, sleep deprivation was used as a form of torture in the Second World War. That's how important and how powerful it can be. When you don't get a good night's sleep, I can't stipulate how important sleep is. Do you know, if you've had an hour or 2 less than your normal sleep, your ratia, your tolerance level is lower. Your even
Got a bit of a headache, frankly.
Headache. What you eat will be different. You're more prone to eat junk or eat at different times. So it really impacts you a lot. Your digestion will be impacted. We really can't, as you say, divorce the mental from the physical, or even the spiritual, which is what we neglect. So those 3, we always talk about mental and physical, but then in my practice, if my client is open to it, once I gauge that they're open to it, I will bring the spiritual aspect into it. If not, then we will go with the evidence-based research about mental and physical, okay? But yeah, so sleep is very important. And another leg is, they call it diet. I don't like to use the word diet because the first 3 letters of diet are D-I-E, die. So I'm like, nutrition, okay? So what's your nutrition like? And if any of these 4 legs are compromised in any way, and this is a real good exercise to go through when you're not feeling on par, is you'll find out what you need to up your game in, which one of these 4 legs. So then there's the sleep, there's the nutrition, like, okay, we all eat junk now and then, but are you eating like nutritious, protein-based, leaf-based food, vegetables, etc., getting all of that in? The third one is exercise, which I just like to refer to as movement, because exercise, I think, automatically go to, lifting weights and going to the gym and running, etc. It can be something as simple as going for a swim, going for a walk, getting out on the golf course. Are you getting your movement in? And another study, which I think most people are very familiar with this aspect, lots of studies, if you go into Google Scholar, you will find there are lots of studies which show that people who have connection, even with one person regularly in their life, or if they live in community, are going to have much better levels of mental and physical well-being. Not only that, but their longevity is increased by connection. And I know a lot of kids will say, so look, just to focus back on that. So these 4 legs, if ever you're not feeling on par, anyone, just go through those 4. Your sleep, your nutrition, your movement, and your connection. Because actually when you're depressed, all of those, or at least 1 or 2 of them, will be compromised quite drastically. So I'm a mental health professional. When I give talks, I will lead with, hey, I'm a mental health professional and I have mental health issues. And just because I've dealt with them, so I had anxiety and depression in 2022. And just because I've dealt with them doesn't mean they're not going to come up again. But now I have the tools and techniques, right? So, and I don't even know if I should say this. I love medicine, and I have a bunch of friends who are doctors. I've worked with doctors, professionally. But I don't like this culture of just prescribing that's going on at the moment. So, and I wouldn't say that had I not experienced it myself. So in 2022, I had some really bad news, and I was just going through. It was just a very intense time. And I sat in my drawing room one day, and I got an email through, and I was like, and literally, I couldn't feel my legs. I literally could not feel my legs. To the point, I got up and I walked around my drawing room because I was like, I have no feeling in my legs. I called up my doctor, who called me back like quite quickly. I'm very lucky I live in a little village, so the GP here is amazing. They called me back and I said, Doc, I can't feel my legs. And he was like, okay, can you come in the next 10 minutes? I think you've got anxiety numbness. I've never heard of anxiety numbness before. Went off, and he's like, oh, you've got anxiety numbness after you've been through all these questions with me, and you have depression. And Roshni, I'm a mental health professional. I was like, no, I don't. I don't have depression. I said, no, I don't. And he was like, okay. So he was kind of like, okay, let's go with this. He said, okay, India. So I do some work with my local GP as well. So he said, okay, India, so how would you describe it? And I said, well, I have some low mood. And then he was like, okay, so what's the difference? So that shut me up, and I just went, okay, fair enough, so I have depression. Right. Do you know, I was like so rallying against accepting that diagnosis because it didn't fit with who I am. This is what I help other people with. So anyhow, prescribed me some medication, and I was like, I don't think I need that at the moment. I help people work on this. I think I'm going to try and do that. And it really did take me down. I was in a really dark place. I remember one Friday evening when I was in the throes of it, walking from my drawing room to my bedroom one evening, and literally in the hallway I just thought, I don't want to be here anymore. And by the time I got to my bedroom, I thought, oh, this is not me. So the next morning I called a friend. He's like, oh, are you okay? And I said, no, I'm not okay. So I staged my own intervention with 4 of my friends. And I wrote down a list, okay, of what was overwhelming me. And then I outsourced it to all of these friends. 2 of them were here in person, 1 joined on FaceTime, 1 joined on the phone, and they all kind of like helped with different things. And actually, when I looked at these points that I'd made before we had this little meeting, self-imposed intervention, none of them was overwhelming, but all together with the way I was feeling at the time, it was way too much for me. And I've never, ever, ever, I promise you, I've never asked for help. And this was, in 2022, I've never asked for help because I've always been that resilient, I'm a Sikh where the warrior raised, and that's how I've been raised, like, resilient, you can do this, suck it up, my little tiger, my little lioness, that kind of thinking. So, so I rallied against that diagnosis, first of all, from my GP, and then every week my GP would call me, bless them, and offer me sertraline for the depression. And every week I would say no. After the 3rd week, I thought, do you know what, my doctor's going to think I'm not helping myself. So I said to my friend, let's walk down to the pharmacy because I've just asked them to send the medication down there. Picked it up, and I promise you it sits here in my drawer till this day. Medication has its place, but for me at that time, I don't think I needed it. So for 1 month, it took me down to that really dark place. And all of the 4 legs of my table were all over the place, apart from sleep, which I've never really struggled with. I couldn't go to the gym, which I was going to regularly before. I wouldn't eat. I would just ignore the calls from my friends. On Friday, would go off to the pub in the next village. I just didn't want to interact as I was isolating myself. I had a diet of things that I would not even have in the house normally. I was on a diet of cheese sandwiches with pickle and a packet of crisps, and that was my meal every day, virtually a month. So first month it took me down. In the 2nd month I thought, right, I'm going to become my own therapist now. I worked with my therapist and I threw out that food, got back to what I was normally eating. This friend of mine dips, and I hated him at the time. He was like, go to the gym, you da-da-da. He was like constantly, every day, literally, we speak every day, so he was on the phone every day, go to the gym. I could not even get out of my front door at that point because that's how depression is. So I thought, you know what, he's getting on my nerves now. But it was helpful because that drip effect helped, and I'd walk to the top of the road, then I drove to the gym and just went for a sauna. The next day I drove to the gym, just went for a steam. By the third time, just that going to the gym, I thought, oh, let me just pop upstairs and do a little workout, and I was back. So that was my sleep had been fine anyway. And with the connection, one of my friends who was involved in my intervention said, I'm going to come and take you out for a walk, and or we'd go off to Henley or somewhere, we'd go for a walk, we'd go for lunch. So he got me out. And that really helps. So I think, having a good look at who your support network is.
Yeah.
And depression is ugly, but you know what? It really served me, and I'm so grateful that I had it, because it made me, and the anxiety numbness, because with my work, it took me deeper. I remember having a 16-year-old. She couldn't even speak. Like, she used to turn up like this into session and hardly say a word. I did stonework with her, where I would just paint stones I'd found on my walks with acrylic paint, and I said to her, okay, on these stones, write how you're feeling. And one of the words that she wrote was suicidal. Anyhow, that, with that particular 16-year-old, was where I think medication is maybe the way to go. She got referred to CAMS. That's not a decision I make. I'm not a medical professional. I'm not, trained to diagnose. I always work within my competence. But she was referred to CAMS, and they got her put on medication. Then she came back to me, and we carried on with our therapy. And she said, oh, that didn't really help me going to CAMS. And I said, why didn't it help? And I get this a lot. And she said, because it was CBT. So with CBT, they give them homework to do. Now, this was a kid. I used to have to walk her to her exam sometimes, because she'd go into the exam room, write down her name, write down the date, and that was it. She could not function. She literally... And I remember saying to her one day, when she was able to engage, because she was on this medication. So the medication got her to a point where she could engage, right, Kay? And that's
exactly
what I think it was great for. And then we need to monitor it. We need to get that reviewed regularly. The dosage might be titrated up or titrated down. So I said to her, when you're depressed, I said, does it feel? And I just went, like, you're like this. You've got this black cloak on you, and it's made of lead, and you just can't even lift your head up. And she went, yes. And I wouldn't have known that had I not experienced depression. I'm not saying, I have to have experienced everything that I work with. But that was very, very helpful. So I think, in that way, lived experience can be amazing when married with a lot of training and learning, etc.
Definitely. I agree. Well, thank you for, again, sharing so vulnerably. I think there's that point that you've touched on so beautifully with such a good example, that in our struggles, which are difficult and hard and make us experience lots of different emotions, there can be a light at the end of the tunnel, and there is a silver lining if you choose to observe and cultivate and just have this deeper sense of your journey to sort of serve, which is sort of how you've beautifully done it, to be like, I can empathise and sympathise in the rawest sense of those meanings. So thank you for sharing that. I mean, there's a couple more questions I wanted to ask you before we finish up, just because you've piqued my interest and you've said so many interesting things, India. I mean, you mentioned this young girl, you've mentioned a few youngsters that you've kind of had therapy with over the years, and you've described for the most part that either they've been itching to move out from home or to have freedom, or that they're suffering with mental health. And something I was listening to earlier this week was around the rise of women entering the workforce and men perhaps losing their place a little bit in the world. Women are fighting for greater equality, and I guess historically women would be more at home raising the children. And in your work, in the 60 years of being that you've had on this planet, you've raised your own children. Do you think that has a direct link, that the woman or the main carer, even if that is the man, but do you think that it should be man or woman in heterosexual relationships? Do you think that there's a link between that parent or a main caretaker being at home and raising that children from an attachment lens, which then obviously informs their mental health. What do you see? Because it's a very taboo question, but I'm curious to ask you.
I don't think it makes any difference whether it's a male, female, two males, two females, you know, a throuple. I really don't. I think more important is that they do have that secure base, whoever that secure base is, okay? And it's about the nurturing. I think it's amazing if a parent can be present in the home. A lot of people correlate with our current family breakdown with the fact that, you know, everyone's out at work now and a lot of children are having to fend for themselves, or they're having to go for daycare and, you know, having other caretakers in place. I think attachment is very important, and I'm just wondering now, from my time living in India, whether actually even the nanny that you have in place, which a lot of families do have, like, you know, a lot of Indians will just have a nanny in place and they're off doing their thing, whether they're homemakers or whether they're out at work. But even that attachment's so very important. That lends to so much nurturing. Yeah, I think it's really important to have those initial attachments in place, because it's but actually more important than that, more than who it is, it's how we're nurtured. Do you know they've done, and in keeping with that, oh, I forget, I should know this now, this was at the beginning of my training, they did this study with baby geese, and it's about imprinting, and actually from the moment they're born it was a human that they were raised by, and he's the one that they would follow everywhere, etc. So it really doesn't matter who is doing the raising, as long as it's your needs are met, as long as they're meeting all of those needs, right? I think that's very, very important.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. I mean, this particular podcast, I really like the Diary of the CEO, and I hadn't listened to Stephen Bartlett's podcast in a while, but this one particularly piqued my interest, and it was Erica someone, really, really interesting. I think they recorded it in March, and I'll give you the brief summary. And the reason why I was curious for your perspective was, like, between 0 and 3, that's when you're like the baby predominantly needs the mum, and that makes sense, right? That touch, that skin to skin contact, that regulates their emotional intelligence, that they benefit from the serotonin, and so they say for it calms their nervous system, exactly. So the baby will, you know, when they're walking, they'll kind of look back, is mummy there, is she watching? And then they go out into the world and they can look, oh, mum's there, I can go a bit further. But without that, you know, the babies are often bewildered. It, like you say, it does a number on their nervous systems, and actually they're experiencing that trauma at a much sooner age, which then means their capacity to burst, either in childhood or in adulthood, is much sooner. And so that was why they were saying that 0 to 1 in particular, you want to withhold as much trauma to that baby as you possibly can for their nervous systems, and then you kind of get a second bite at the cherry from between, I think she said it was 9 and 25, I think it was, where again they're growing into that sort of teenage adolescence period. And you have to remember what she was saying, and I thought this was really interesting. We're currently making it on our schedule. Oh, we'll have the nanny, we'll have, you know, nanny take care of her, or, you know, my sister take care. But actually that child needs you as that primary caregiver. And like you say, I think for the first few years, this is my personal view, I think it should be the mum, but I think that does not mean that women shouldn't have a career or do what they want. I think it needs to be a joint responsibility, but understanding that I think to be a parent, it's the biggest responsibility you could ever have, and it's probably the biggest job you'll ever do. Nothing comes close to it. So if you're going to enter into it to be conscious and not an unconscious parent, you've got to do the right thing on their schedule, and then build back your career, build back. And I say that being a professional woman and understanding it's very hard for people. There are inequalities even in that system. So it's certainly not a perfect system. But I mean that to say that actually I thought Erica's point was right, that if we can get the right help for these mums and dads, then actually we're going to grow healthier children. We'll have less dependence on our NHS, or in our medical in our hospitals, and in the care system more generally, because we've got well adjusted, well attuned, securely attached, happy people, or little children that will go on to become something in this world. And actually, if we all collectively have that, won't we have a better society? So I certainly see the big picture of it. I thought it was a fascinating podcast. I'm just curious for your immediate thoughts.
I love that, and I agree with a lot of that myself, and some parts I don't. In an ideal world, amazing. And me being a woman of a certain age and this is something that I'm very conscious and aware of, having the upbringing that I do, I kind of automatically tend to go to, that nurturing, bonding, having that attunement, that regulation with your child, skin on skin, as you say, very, very, very important. The world that we live in is not an ideal world. A lot of parents, both of them, have to go out to work. It's not just when a child is born. Some people, on zero contracts. Some people are self-employed. They don't have they just don't have that privilege of not working. So
totally.
It does, and so I think that's really important to bear in mind, so that we're not judging these parents who can't do that. Would it be great? If I had to go back and have my time, would I want to be a stay-at-home mum? Definitely for the initial few years. And actually, the way that I didn't raise my children is the way that we are raising my grandchildren. My daughter-in-law is at home. She is like the primary caregiver, but my son does work from home a lot and still has a lot of involvement. So I love the way that they're consciously parenting, and I love that, but that's because they can. Not everybody can. And so I think it's really important that you have that. And I remember when they were looking for childcare, when my daughter-in-law was working with my eldest grandchild, and they were just talking about getting a nanny in and everything, and I just said, I was a bit wary, and I said, you hear all of these stories, etc. Be really careful, really do your vetting and all of this. And taking that on board, they just decided actually she wasn't going to go back into the workplace just now, until they felt that the time was right. That's a real place of privilege.
I get that, and I'm glad you brought it up.
It's ideal. Even if a grandparent, even if a parent is at home, a mother is able to be at home, she might not necessarily be bonding with her child. She might have postnatal depression. We just don't know. So I don't think it's a case of who. I think it's how. I think it's the intent there. I think it's, the care. Someone who's able to meet the needs. You might have a mother who's not able to meet the needs at all.
Totally. Such a great point. Oh, totally. And I think you've brought such nuance to that point. And I hope I didn't mean it like this is what it should be. You're right. It has to be what's practical for your financial means. You're right. It often does take two incomes to sustain in the world we live in. I think this was, like you say, the gold plate, the gold standard. If people so could, let's not. I think the point she was trying to make, which was the right point, is please don't be selfish. If you can do, obviously, go prioritise putting food on the family's plate, but don't be selfish. This desire that I think men and women both have, we want to make our careers. Don't do it at the detriment of your children because you have a few years. And I think it's so hard for people to accept that competing truth, because we do want both genders to flourish, to make money, to be self-sufficient. Obviously, you alluded to it yourself, right? You had relied on these men in your own childhood to provide. Now, 10 years on, you've had to provide, you've had to learn so much. And I think it's important women in particular have those financial means, but that's in direct opposition with also wanting to be a mother and nurturing. So how can they do that and not feel guilty? I think it's a really hard line, and it's often in direct correlation with your career and you having children, that your career will be going up, and you having more childcare, or we're that sandwich generation. We've then got older parents, so there's a lot there. I'm certainly not trying to make anyone feel bad. I just thought it was a really interesting point when I look at mental health of youngsters, social media running havoc with them. I do think that there's something to be said for a parent or a grandparent or someone who has got the children's best interest, even if that is a nanny. I don't think that that's a bad thing. But I think there's nothing to take away from that immediate, that parent, mum or dad, to have that, and ideally mum, I still think, from what I've understood, that skin on skin contact, that regulation. I think that piece is so important. And what she's saying is that if you invest for those few years, actually you'll have a lot less to do in the years after. So it's not making this strategic, but I also think just make that little investment if you can.
Yeah.
And then maybe in theory you've got a much easier time with it, and we've got better, well-adjusted adults, and so maybe it's less of a burden on society, and we've got good leaders, and we've got good, inspiring people who are high EQ in this world that we're living in, where we haven't got that. That's my very big picture thinking.
Do you know the systems we have in place need to be tweaked to accommodate that kind of caring, that kind of
Yeah.
presence?
Oh, totally.
But I really, and I totally get it, and I agree with it, because actually, where does attachment occur? It's in the formative years, and the gold standard. I tend to refer to it as the gold standard. It's not in the industry referred to as the gold standard. That's just an India thing. Because when I'm going through attachment.
Yeah, but it is the gold standard. I get what you're saying. That's if you can, you're killing it. But that doesn't mean if you aren't that you're a bad parent. That's not what we're suggesting. It's just let's fight about it to get this in society. Let's get this as a system. It's good for our society. But still, let's also honour, female empowerment and female independence and females having a voice. That's not to take away any of that work. It's to encourage it, but to change the system so that we can have that. And fathers are also supporting hand, equally.
To accommodate it, and for same-sex couples, to accommodate
Indeed.
it for either
Indeed.
party. Just to rewind and going back to the attachment thing. So yeah, a secure attachment is the gold standard, and beautiful if we can, be that for our children. But what about and all of the insecure attachments that are born, which and most of us sit on that spectrum? I mean, but they can be. I don't want to use this word, but they can be rectified. We can earn a secure attachment, and this can be done through primary caregivers. This can be done through teachers. A lot of it happens. Rupture occurs in relationship, and it's repaired in relationship, right? So experiences that we have in relationships going forward can actually not repair, but lead towards a more secure attachment and how we show up in the world. So yeah, I agree with a lot of what you said that podcast was promoting, but there are so many other nuances, as you say, to play,
Totally.
variables that need to be considered.
Totally. And I mean, I'd encourage people to listen to it. I'm almost just cribbing the point, which I thought was very fascinating, because we were talking about it, and we've talked about attachment styles, we've talked about youngsters. I was like, let me mention it, but certainly people do check it out. And I'm not giving my view one way or another. I just think that there is some merit to the points that are an uncomfortable truth, as she describes it, and I accept that. But lots of nuance, which I think we can't capture. It's food for thought.
I might actually have a look at that.
Do. But no, thank you, India. I think we've sort of touched on so many different things. I guess my final question for you, or two final questions for you, is, you're 60, you've experienced so much. What's the next steps? Looking forward, what are your aspirations? What's your plan? Also, I'll start with that actually, and then I'll ask you the final question.
Yeah. So, I've never been one for birthdays. I don't actually even like celebrating my birthday. The big decades have been celebrated quite big, but I'm not one for birthdays. I'm quite happy just to do something really low key. But 60 kind of hit different, and I don't know why. And maybe it's the last trimester of my life, or there's a certain liberation in it, and I really love being 60. So I turned 60 in January, And I was reflecting on it when I was journaling just a few weeks ago about why it's such a big deal to me. I was like, why? Because I don't consciously know why. So I thought, why does it feel so different? My dad died at 54. So my 54th birthday was one I really didn't want to celebrate. It was a real year of reflection. And I just think, even now, I'm still learning, growing. You know, there's so much I lack awareness in, and this beautiful journey of life. And it's such a privilege to be here, you know, at this age, especially for me, in view of my personal history, as in my dad passing at that age. So I love being 60. It's just liberated me. Like, you know, I should be retired at this age, you know, in the old system. So I've decided to kind of like semi-retire myself. So like I said, I work 3 days. I work afternoons and early evenings. I love my private practice. I don't travel anymore. I've rented an office in my village so I can walk to work, which is beautiful. So I've kind of like crafted this life that I love. Am I where I want to be? No, I still have aspirations and goals and all of that. What are they? One of them is I want to start a podcast. Why, as a 60-year-old Indian woman starting a podcast, like, you know, why would you? I guess because I can.
Why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't you?
Why wouldn't I, right? It's because I kind of can. And because I just think, I mean, we haven't even touched the surface of my own life, but I think if there was a hard way to do things, Roshni, your girl here would find it, you know. And after all, I promise you, and it's been hard, and I don't want it to be hard for you, so I know the way, let me show you, is my kind of thing. And another thing that lent to why I want to start it is, I remember speaking to this, and he's a very articulate individual, like, you know, amazing human being, struggling, and I said to him a little while back, I was like, okay, so who's your support system? And the answer stays with me till this day, and he went, my medication. And you. I was like, wow. And then more recently than that, a client said to me, oh, do you know what, I'm going to have a hen party, he wants to propose, but I haven't got any friends, I've just got one friend, what am I going to do? So there was this whole thing about, you know, what social media tells us, you've got to go away and have a massive hen party and do this. And I said, well, that's okay. Like, you know, it's kind of like, there's a lot of loneliness, feelings of isolation, but actually we can reframe that. Like when I worked in substance misuse, criminal justice and substance misuse, that was a standard question to ask, who's your support system? And people say no one, because at that point they've burnt their bridges, right? They've been in prison, they've been homeless, or they've sofa served, friends and family are fed up of them and their addiction. So they're like, I don't have a support system. And I'm like, well, I'm your support system. And you engage regularly with your GP, they're your support system, and you know, other people that they might be involved with, whether that's probation or social services or whoever. We have to reframe what our support system is and what it looks like, and draw on it. Like, you know, me with my staging my own intervention, I knew the people who I would turn to for that. I have, you know, all these friends, but they were the ones that I knew would be there. So no system is. So yeah, in another way, this podcast, I want it just to be a safe place to land for you to just, you know.
No, I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, I have no idea what I'm doing. I really don't.
I don't think many do. I think that's the whole point of it. Like we've spoken about, you just have fun and, you know, go forward, and hopefully people enjoy and resonate with the content. And that's, you know, I don't know, maybe people are more.
If it's just you and me listening, or, you know, a couple of my friends that say, well, I'll listen, that's enough, right? And it's a passion project. It's not something I'm doing weekly, fortnightly. I just don't have the capacity for that at the moment. I want to do it on a monthly basis. I want it to be a soft place to land, as I say, where we can just grow together, where we can have conversations like this, where, you know, we can be vulnerable. It's about everyday people. Like, you know, if you have someone who has a story to tell, or if you have a story to tell.
Well, this week we've showcased you, India. What a story you have had to share. And like you say, we are only scratching the surface about, you know, your rich life, the difficulties, the depression, the anxiety, the burnout, you know, the divorce. There's a lot there, big subjects that we've covered. And, you know, as I said, we've only scratched the surface. So thank you for sharing organically and heartfeltly. And Also telling us a bit, giving us a bit of a window into your soul, which is what I like these podcasts to be. I guess my very final question was, you've read a lot. You're clearly very sort of smart and clued up about self-inquiry and spirituality and trauma. Do you have any books or any podcasts or any references that you could make that people that are interested in some of these subjects that we've spoken about could go and learn more?
One of my go-to books, and I recommend this to a lot of my clients, especially if there is trauma there, is Bessel van der Kolk's The Body Keeps a Score. I love that
Yeah.
book. It's like a little Bible. I've not even read it cover to cover. I just dip in and out of it where I want, because it marries generational trauma, the mental, and how it actually impacts us somatically,
Yes.
which I think we really underplay. So that would be one book. Gosh, so many books. On a spiritual level, a book that a friend gifted to me years ago, and I tried to read, and it was really hard to read, and I tried for months on end, and it just sat on my bookshelf until, it metaphorically one day just leapt off my bookshelf many years later. I devoured it. Autobiography of a yogi, Paramahansa Yogananda.
Yes.
Oh my
Yes.
God. I keep meaning to go back and read that book, because there's just so much about just your intent and about trusting and just having trust in the process and your journey, etc. And bound in this beautiful cape of spirituality, but with such rich tapestry. The tapestry of life in there, actually. So that's such a beautiful book. I love that book. Gosh, so many books. Why are they not coming to mind? I almost want to go. I'm reading one at the moment that one of my therapist friends recommended, which is Secure Love, who is
Oh, Julie Manano. I know the
Manano.
one.
Love
Yeah,
her
brilliant
book.
book.
Yeah,
Absolutely brilliant. Yeah, that's probably one. I think that's a brilliant book. Yeah,
and if
highly
you're interested
recommend.
in attachment, which is so vital, so important, permeates all our relationships, including our relationship with ourselves.
Yeah, phenomenal book.
Wow. And do you know, this kind of thing is something that should be taught in school. Attachment styles should be taught in school. Finances should be
Love languages as
taught.
well. You mentioned with the mum and the mother-in-law. Brilliant. So
Yeah,
such vital information, right?
it
They're just
really
missing the
is.
mark, but it was born out of love.
So the school I was at, I just started to give talks there, and it was beautiful to give these talks to the sixth formers, and it was about looking for the red flags in relationships, because this is what they're going into. The green flags in relationships. What are your beige flags there? Just giving talks on that. Making it okay to talk about that kind of thing, raising awareness around
Totally.
it. You know, what other books? Why am I? Gosh, so many. If I walk over to my bookshelf, there are just like so many.
No, don't worry.
Those two really good books. I mean, I read a lot of stuff on trauma. I love the work of Gabor Mate, which informed
Yeah.
me when I was in criminal justice substance misuse, actually, along with all of the training that I did there, putting that to use. But it was just like his teachings.
Yeah.
Love his work.
He's brilliant. Yeah.
Trauma is not what happens to us, it's how we perceive what happens to us. And actually, what are we seeking? At the core of it is we're seeking relief from something. And that touches on a personal belief of mine, is that, we operate from one of two places, either from fear or love. So anytime that you're doing something or questioning something that you're doing, just ask yourself that question: am I doing this from a place of fear or love? And it's a really beautiful inquiry. And
Often it's a bit of both, though, isn't it? Sometimes, and that's the hard bit.
I think it'll be one or the other.
Ah, okay.
Essentially, when you drop down into it. And Brené Brown, so it's all coming out now. Brené Brown, I love her work. One of her phrases I love, and which really spoke to me years ago when I first started this therapy journey, was vulnerability, because I couldn't be vulnerable. I was like this strong, self-sufficient sort of person, even though I wasn't. Vulnerability is courage in action, allowing yourself to be vulnerable, allowing yourself to ask for help. We're actually all just muddling through. There's nothing that anyone is going to go through that someone hasn't gone through before. But when we're in
Totally.
isolation, right? So when we're in isolation, when we're constricted like this, we have that shame, the guilt, and we're carrying it alone because of fear of judgment. And even though I'm not a religious person, I'm particularly godly and spiritual, but it's kind of drawn that godliness within you.
Yeah.
You know, I have in my phone, I have a reminder which says, "What would the hand of God do?" In an
Mm.
So it's drawing on that. And I'm no saint, believe me, right? A saint I ain't by any stretch of the imagination. So yeah, Brené Brown's work really informs me. Atlas of the Heart is a really good book of hers. Um, Gosh, so
Thank
many.
you.
Yeah,
So many. I mean, you've shared very generously, and I'm very grateful to you for doing that. I mean, this has been such a joy. Probably my longest podcast,
is
India.
it? Because
I
I
didn't have the
can't.
heart to stop, but there was just so much good stuff there. But you've said so many beautiful things. You've shared so generously. So thank you. And you're a great example of being a glass half full kind of gal, which I love. And I like to end on a quote for Primrose Light. And the quote that I had for you all today was, people who wonder if the glass is half empty or half full miss the point. The glass is refillable. And isn't that so true? And aren't you a wonderful example of that? That at 60, you've got still this youthful quest for exploration and enjoyment and serving. The work you're doing in therapy is serving people. So thank you very much for all that you're doing in that space. And obviously, I know you do much more beyond too. So thank you very much, India, for coming on Primrose Light and sharing a bit about your story.
Roshni, thank you for having me. Absolute privilege. It's my first ever podcast.
I know. Well, it's good
Exciting.
practice for you to run your own. So hopefully you've enjoyed the way we've created a nice sort of dynamic and conversation. I hope for everyone that's listening, this has left something for you to ponder and reflect. And as I always say, in a world where we can be anything, let's be kind.
I
So
love
do pass
that.
that goodness on to others as we go
Appreciate.
forward.
Do you know, I
Indeed.
wanted to leave you with a quote, and this is something
Tell
that's
me.
in psychotherapy, we have something called the storied self. So our life is just a story that we've told ourselves. So it's kind of like the story you tell yourself is who you become, and at any
Totally.
point you can script a different narrative, a different story. Um,
Totally.
and that's a whole different thing that we could talk about perhaps another time. But yeah, so don't let your story so far limit what your story can be, right?
That's beautiful. And also, don't make that story so negative that you just live here, right? Think about it. This
There's
is here for my growth, as you did. And
always, out of every adversity that you have ever had, there will be some element of growth if you choose to look for it,
totally,
right?
you're a lady that resonates on my vibe. That's exactly how I think. If we
Yeah,
can aspire for that level of thinking in each interaction we have, then we'll only be blessed. And actually, like you say, those Holocaust survivors, they didn't let it get here. So I think we've sort of come full circle on some of these beautiful themes,
yeah.
which are so poignant and deeply spiritual and profound. So thank you, India, for
Thank
being
you.
such a vessel for these beautiful conversations. Thank you, everyone, for listening. And until next time, you take care. God bless.